Hello everyone, my name is Will Bosley, and I will be giving my presentation on the inadequate democratic functions that currently exist in the United States. So without further ado, let us dive into the presentation. So a bit of background information. This will be crucial for understanding upcoming slides, just giving a quick recourse. Um, so the United States of America was founded on July 4th, 1776, the publishing of the Declaration of Independence, primarily written by Thomas Jefferson. There are three branches of government, those being the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. The latter we will not be discussing, uh, at least in majorly. Um, uh, Judicial branch includes legal structures and frameworks such as um, the district courts, federal courts, and the Supreme Court. Moving on, the United States is classified as a federal republic government. This means there are two separate forms of government. Um, so you have a federal government and then you have a state government. Both have their own unique powers, privileges, and roles to fill. The second word in here, republic, means that there are representatives to serve the people's needs, opinions, and voices. Um, all the elected officials you could think of, House members, senators, even the president are there to serve people. Um, so checks and balances, this is the primary philosophy the United States is built upon. Um, each of these three branches are there to keep each other in check. Each have their own powers, and for the government to work properly, it requires the cooperation of all three branches of government. To summarize, one branch cannot have all the power and is not able to steamroll all the two other branches due to checks and balances. So Washington, D.C. is the capital city of the United States. This top image over here, we could see me and my brother on the National Mall, uh, right in front of the Capitol building. Washington, D.C. is where obviously Congress is housed, as well as the White House, and many federal agencies. It's where the federal government is headquartered. There are two major political parties in the United States. First, you have the Democratic Party, which is the more socially and fiscally liberal of the two, supporting measures such as universal health care and more progressive taxing, while the Republican Party is more fiscally and socially conservative, uh, prohibiting reproductive rights and advocating for lower taxes for both wealthy and the poor. Moving on to the House of Representatives, it's the lower chamber of Congress, which includes 435 total representatives. So the number of districts per state corresponds to the population of said state. So a state like Vermont only has one representative, while a state like California has 52, which is due to the population of each state being drastically different. While Vermont has a population lower than 1 million, California has over 35 million, meaning that there needs to be more representation uh, for that state uh, due to having a massive population. So the average district population is roughly 750,000. This has increased over the years as the total amount of representatives has not risen from 435 in decades. So the Speaker of the House acts as the leader. This bottom left image over here, we see Mike Johnson, who is the Republican Speaker of the House currently, ever since former Speaker Kevin McCarthy was ousted in early October. He was elected in late October. Next to him on the right, we can see Hakeem Jeffries, who serves as uh, the minority House leader for the Democrats. So there are elections for all members every 2 years. So midterms and presidential elections, every member of Congress is required to run for their seat again. Um, so the duties of um, the House of Representatives is primarily legislative based. It's there to draft and vote on bills and legislation, but it also does have some other functions such as funding the government, raising the debt ceiling, um, and generally being the most representative form of um, federal government. This top left image over here, we can see my um, representative, um, Frank Pallone, um, who's been serving since 1988, um, as well as the district that he serves, which is the 6th district. Um, so moving on to the U.S. Senate, which is the upper chamber of Congress. Um, so this chamber of Congress includes 100 total members in comparison to the House's 435. And there are 2 senators per state. Um, this obviously means that the Senate is not representative of the state's population. No matter the population, even a very small populated state like Wyoming, has 2 senators, and California, the most populated state, has 2 senators as well. Um, so there are majority and minority leaders for each party, similar to the um, House of Representatives. We can see these on the bottom images where we see Chuck Schumer, who is the House, or not House, Senate Majority Leader currently, serving for the Democrats, and Mitch McConnell, who is a Senate Minority Leader for the Republicans. Um, so senators are elected for 6-year terms. Um, so roughly a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years in a format that is Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Um, And a fun fact that many people don't know is that up until 1913, uh, there was no direct voting for senators. This was changed then. Um, so for only senators, and before that, it was the House of Representatives who would do that. Um, so some duties of the Senate, it's a little more varied than the House. Still focused on legislation, but it's also focuses on oversight of certain divisions of government, as well as appointing certain cabinet officials and even Supreme Court members. Moving on to our last branch that we're going to be mentioning, the executive branch. Uh, this revolves around the president. It's currently Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who's the vice president, also a Democrat. Um, the executive branch also includes other bureaucratic structures. Some agencies include the United States Postal Service, um, Federal Communications Commission, also known as FCC, and the Federal Reserve System. So there is a presidential election every 4 years, which uses the Electoral College system, which we'll get into later. Um, So there are a lot of duties and powers allocated to the executive branch, primarily the president. The president has veto power, which means that even if the House and the Senate pass um, uh, legislation onto the president, he has the ability to veto it, which basically turn it down. And those the House and Senate could override the veto, but that requires a 2/3 majority vote from each chamber. President also has pardon power. This allows the president to basically pardon any individual of a crime. Um, Another power of the president is executive orders, which um, are very unique and uh, complicated. Um, You also have appointments for Supreme Court seats, you know, district and federal courts. Lastly, um, uh, president serves as commander-in-chief of the military, so has a lot of control over, the U.S. military and all its subdivisions. This the bottom image, we can see Antony Blinken, who serves uh, as chief staffer of the White House. So moving on to our first issue for democracy is gerrymandering. So gerrymandering um, is the process of drawing uh, House of Representative districts in a fashion to purposely misrepresent people. So there are two ways of doing this. You have packing, which is concentrating members of specific political demographic groups um, into a certain small amount of electoral districts. This allows for uh, votes to be wasted there, as those districts will be very very partisan. The other way of gerrymandering is cracking, which involves spreading out a particular political or demographic group across many electoral districts to dilute the power of, a certain voter group. So, one thing interesting about gerrymandering is the racial aspect of it. So, certain racial groups will vote for certain political parties more than others. For example, the African American vote goes almost goes over 4/5 to the Democrats generally, while the white population is generally more Republican than Democrat. Um, so gerrymandering has been, a topic of controversy and has been through the legal system many times. Uh, but it has been affirmed in several rulings by the Supreme Court and is still legal to this day. Example of a case is the Gill versus Whitford landmark case that unanimously ruled that the plaintiffs failed to prove injury and lacked standing. Um, they what the plaintiffs did was they fought against unfairly drawn redistrict House of Representatives map for Wisconsin, which the local courts in Wisconsin ruled in favor of them, but Supreme Court would overturn that decision. Um, so yeah, like I said, racial groups, a racial gerrymandering hasn't been legal since the landmark case of Shaw versus Reno in 1993. Um, doesn't mean it still happens, but it's a little more discreet now. The maps that we see for the House are drawn by state legislatures and approved by the governors. Um, so, a party that has a trifecta in, a state government will be able to draw a district that, obviously unfairly uh, a certain political party. On the bottom image here, middle image, we can see Tom Hoffler, who used to serve as the redistricting director, who would draw uh, very gerrymandered maps, especially for North Carolina. On the left, we can see a political cartoon drawing of uh, of the Supreme Court voting to leave gerrymandering in. And as well, on the top two images, on the left, we could see an example of how gerrymandering works, where districts, even though, red has a minority of votes, or uh, um, it could be done unfairly to have more representation, having three districts over here, using the packing and cracking strategies previously discussed. Um, to the right of that image, we could see um, some examples of gerrymandered maps. Notice the thin lines here. We could that indicates that these maps were drawn to um, include and disclude certain uh, groups. So moving on to disproportional representation. So states obviously vary in population, like we discussed for the House of Representatives and the Senate earlier. Uh, but like I mentioned earlier as well, the Senate is not based on population. The representation, uh, the population does not matter. Each state will get two senators regardless. Um, so example of this is, this bottom image on the right, where we see California, which has a population of 38 million, and a bunch of states adding up to 38 million. You see that California only has two senators to represent that 38 million, while the other 38 million has of total representation has 44 total senators, which really shows how disproportionate the representation for the Senate is. So generally, less populated states have more power in the U.S. Um, and this brings up a pretty um, hotly debated argument of state representation versus democracy, since the U.S. Senate was originally created to fight for the rights and issues that states supported. Um, this very long, ongoing battle that is still being hotly debated up to this day. Moving on to our final issue, the Electoral College. This is um, this uh, is for the executive branch for presidential elections. Like I just mentioned earlier, president is elected by the Electoral College. So some issues with the Electoral College is that popular vote is ignored. For example, on the bottom right image, we can see the 2016 election results where even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, she still lost the electoral vote, and that would lead to her losing the 2016 election. So there are such things. There's such states called swing states. These are states that are very close in partisanship, um, and could go either way. Um, me- uh, Usually, presidential candidates will focus on these specific states, as shown in this bottom left image, where Wisconsin had 40 campaign visits, while a bunch of other more partisan states for Democrat and Republicans were only visited once. Um, so the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system. So if a candidate wins a majority of the votes in a state, that candidate will get all the electoral votes, even if the margin was extremely close. This could lead to a lot of people's votes being unrepresented within the Electoral College. Our last point here is faithless electors. This is a more hidden aspect of the Electoral College. What many people don't know is the Electoral College, um, people aren't directly voting. There are electors who vote on behalf for each state, and while um, there are certain rules for each state for faithless electors. Some states punish faithless electors who vote against what the people voted for. It's not for every state. So moving on to our first remedy for these three issues is civics and education. So Civics and education is massively underfunded and lacking in the United States. Um, and this, is primarily in our public school systems where even some states don't require civics at all. Um, some benefits of civic education includes people being less prone to authoritarian candidates, um, being able to recognize the signs better. Um, uh, so, and authoritarian candidates, obviously want to gut democracy or at least uh, diminish it. So, um, that's a direct threat to democracy. So, people being more aware of that will um, lead to less authoritarian candidates getting elected. Um, civics and education could um, also affects media literacy. Um, people being media literacy is basically people being able to understand, um, you know, uh, how certain outlets are biased in certain ways. Such as Fox News being right wing and CNN generally being considered left wing. People being able to recognize how certain sources of information are biased is uh, very lacking in it, where most news sources and outlets are politically biased in one way or the other. So, um, civics and education will obviously increase civic engagement. People will know how to vote and how to navigate the system, which which is a little intimidating for people who have never voted before or have never, experienced a course in civics. Lastly, civics and education leads to more informed citizens, which is obvious since education uh, leads to people learning, about uh, the certain topics. So people learning about civics will lead to them being more informed about the political and governmental institutions in the United States. Our second remedy is increasing voting rights. So there are three main bills in that have been introduced in the past decade to Congress to that support voting rights. You have the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is based around John Lewis, who is a House of Representatives member from the Georgia's 5th District, who played a major role in civil rights movement of the 1960s, being one of the big six to help organize the 1963 March on Washington, as well as being one of the 13 original Freedom Riders. So there was so that Voting Act is there to after his death in 2020, um, it's there to keep pushing for a bunch of the voting right measures that he supported. The second act is the Freedom to Vote Act. It's a little more recent. It's very similar to the previous act, supporting a lot of these common provisions on the bottom, such as outlawing gerrymandering, better accessibility to voting, and finance reform, as well as making Election Day a national holiday. And then For the People Act is probably the most well-known one, also known as HR 1. Um, it was supported by John Lewis as well before his death in 2020. Um, and while all these bills have been introduced to Congress and even voted on, and some even passing the U.S. House of Representatives, none have been put into law yet or have even passed the U.S. Senate. Um, so going back to the common provisions, so the election day as a national holiday is very commonly included in these sorts of voting right acts. It can be very difficult for people to um, vote on election day since it's not classified as a national holiday. So people have to go into work uh, or busy performing other uh, needs. Um, next, so that would help uh, create better voter turnout. The next provision is outlawing gerrymandering. As we discussed gerrymandering in the previous slide, this is it directly disenfranchises a lot of voters. So outlawing gerrymandering, gerrymandering as a whole um, will help to increase voting rights for people. The next one is better accessibility. This one ties into Election Day as a national holiday, but also includes less restrictive measures of being able to cast mail-in votes more easily, less strict voter ID laws, uh, around that sort. Finance reform. Um, fine, finance and money in politics has been an issue for a while, and transparency in government when it comes to financing will people see certain candidates. Moving on to our last remedy is ranked choice voting. So this system is also called instant runoff voting. It's already used in many states. It's even used in Maine and Alaska in state and federal elections. Um, so the most famous case of ranked choice voting was in the 2022 Alaska House special election after the death of former Representative Dong Young after serving for 49 years. So, former Governor Sarah Palin was John McCain's running mate in the 2008 presidential election. Um, ran along with another Republican candidate named Nick Ben Beniguch. So they ran together, but they had bad. They while they were both Republicans, had extremely different ideologies. And in the ranked choice voting system, where I'll discuss it in a little more depth a little bit, is where people rank the certain candidates from their first choice, second choice, the third choice. There was people ranking the Democrat Mary Batola, which we could see here, over Sarah Palin. Um, so that would lead to Mary Batola winning in Alaska, which was considered to be a very red state at the time. Um, so to go back to describing ranked choice voting, so ranked choice voting is um, relatively new system of voting. It's a little more complicated than simple first across the post voting. So as we can see on this ballot on the bottom right, we see how people are able to rank each candidate. So people have, for example, this person put candidate B as their first choice, and candidate C, candidate A, candidate E, and then candidate D. So let's say um, so when the votes are tallied, the person with the least amount of votes will be eliminated, and anyone's first vote who voted for that specific candidate will be allocated towards their second choice. And this goes on until there are only two candidates left, where there is a clear majority of votes towards a single candidate. It's a little difficult to explain, um, but in essence, it's a more representative way of counting people's votes, where people's votes are not wasted. Um, in addition, this discourages negative campaigns against each other. Uh, so candidates will have to focus on advocating for themselves and why they should be elected instead of running smear campaigns against other candidates. The last positive for ranked choice voting is better representation. So obviously more candidates. Well, it's been argued there is some controversy around if this will uh, break the current two-party system that is in the United States. It will certainly include more candidates from each of the two parties, which will allow for people to be better represented by their own political views. Some negatives about ranked choice voting are that there are slightly longer elections, since they have to count the votes multiple times and recalculate. So it could take a little longer. And another negative is that it's more difficult to understand. Um, as as it was pretty evident, it's kind of difficult to explain ranked choice voting in a short segment. Uh, but um, but I see, but these two negatives are uh, pretty minor, and I believe that they pale in comparison to the positives, which are, um, I think, outweigh the negatives pretty significantly. That brings us to my final thoughts. United States has the oldest continuous democracy um, since the adoption of the Constitution in 1786. Um, so in the past few years, as we can see on the top chart on the right, there has been democratic backsliding, which basically means uh, democracy as a whole in the U.S. has been declining. This could be due to many reasons. Some commonly presented reasons are, the January 6th riots, erosion of voting rights, um, the rise of authoritarianism, and m- uh, increase of gerrymandering. Um, so while it could be pessimistic about it'd be easy to be pessimistic about the current state of democracy, it's important to remember that change starts with the people. Example of this is that, you know, in the late 60s, there was a push to abolish the Electoral College, which almost came to fruition. This came as a result as a civil rights movement, um, where people believed that this the Electoral College was uh, disfranchising and not properly represent populations of people, specifically Black people. Um, and lastly, to finish out this presentation, it's been proven time and time again throughout history that public opinion will prevail. We could see this with, prohibition and marijuana, both being, outlawed and then later legalized, where the opinion of people will uh, can influence um, certain so voting rights. Maybe in the near future we could see uh, 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 fighting uh, and more democracy in total being implemented in the United States. So here are my sources. So yeah, that was my presentation on the inadequate democracy in the United States. And thank you for watching.